I'll be basically looking at, in particular, the public policy framing of Muslims schooling vis-a-vis the question of self-segregation. So that's the kind of context, if you like. Now, there's two ways that you can actually look at this. The first way is that most people actually tend to think that that this idea of looking at the Muslim community through the lenses of segregation or self-segregation actually started off in 2001, post 2001 riots in Bradford, Burnley, and Oldham. But in fact, if you take the longer view, you can actually see that the question of segregation is a key framing that can be taken back way back to the 60s, in fact the mid 1950s. So what you basically have since the inception of Muslims in the UK post Second World War, the community has always been framed in relation to this idea of segregation or self-segregation. So I guess what my book is going to be this paper it'll be drawing upon my book that was published back in 2015. So I'll be taking some key elements of that. Now, if I really wanted to summarize my paper, I could actually quote W.E.B. Dubois, the great black intellectual who not only inspired the likes of Malcolm X and various other people, but I mean he was a prolific reader, thinker, academic, activist, etc. And he summarized it really well in relation to the black community in the States, in which he basically said, and I quote, "The Negro child needed neither segregated schools nor mixed schools. What they need is education." And as a sociologist like W.E.B. Du Bois, he certainly knew the distinction between schooling and education. A lot of people actually think that both of them are actually the same. Essentially, there are two completely different processes. I'll give you just a quick example. You can actually go through schooling without actually getting an education. And you can actually spend your time in prison and get a good education. The classical example is Malcolm X's autobiography. I mean, his education was actually in the prison system itself. So I think there's a really important kind of distinction that's actually there. And I think very much in the contemporary discourse, what you basically have is that the schooling process has a particular neoliberal emphasis, which is economically determined. So in other words, that you go to school in order to actually fulfill your role within the economy. And that, I mean, we were just having this conversation just earlier on, and that's problematic in itself. So I think there's element there. And I think really, if you really want to summarize it in relation to the Muslims in the UK, what Muslims have always wanted is education. They didn't necessarily need any segregation or integration. The key element, the key emphasis there is actually kind of education, if you like. So this is the book, and what I'd like to do is what sociologists basically do is what's known as problematizing the debates, and what I want to basically do now is to problematize this idea of segregation. And I'm basically saying that there's three key problems in relation to looking at the Muslim communities through the lenses of segregation. The first is the problem of definition. What exactly do we mean by integration? The second is a problem of evidence. So in other words, what's the empirical data? Does the empirical data actually suggest that there is spatial segregation within the UK context? And finally, I feel that there is a big problem of interpretation. So in other words, what do we mean when we say segregation or integration? So essentially, those are the three key aspects that I'm going to be kind of looking at. Now, if we start off with the first, which is the problem of definition. I always basically find that this idea of requesting Muslims to integrate starts off with a certain premise, assuming that there is a clear definition as to what integration actually means. And for my recent book, I've been very much spending a lot of time in the archives in the University of Manchester and various other kind of archives where you can actually get government reports dating back to the mid-50s. And the things that you basically find, if you take the long view from the 60s to onwards, it's very clear that there isn't any fixed definition as to what integration means. Often the case, you basically find that integration is often conflated with assimilation. These are two completely different sociological phenomena. And also you can actually get this idea that whereby integration is often conflated with multiculturalism. And more recently you get this conflation once again with integration with counterterrorism, de-radicalization, etc. So I think the key point there is that there's no hard definition as to what integration basically means. And in my own spare time, I do like to do some youth. I have a background in youth work, and then occasionally what I basically do is to walk the streets of Manchester, and you speak to the young kids on the streets, speak to their parents, etc. And once again, you get this idea that nobody has a clear understanding of what integration means. So, for example, I could actually take you to the streets of, say, for example, Oldham, at 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock, Tesco's, and I can guarantee you around about 9:30, 10 o'clock, you have a rush of young Muslim boys and girls reaching out for vodka bottles. And then I can actually walk you the same streets after Fajr time, around about, say, for example, 6 o'clock, and you find that there's empty vodka bottles within that particular geographical kind of area. So once again, when the government or the media discourse is actually out there as to integration, the parents are basically saying that is not one type of integration that we want. Or take another example of a taxi driver, Asian, Pakistani heritage taxi driver that works in the nighttime economy, picking up young girls of a certain age, dropping them off from one pub to another pub to another pub. In his mind, he has a certain understanding of what integration is. So I think basically what you get is a difficulty in the sense that nobody exactly knows what integration actually means, what it actually implies. Grossly kind of stereotyping, for the sake of simplicity. And always I find this quite amusing, during the Christmas vacation. This is a classical example. Christmas is banned, it offends Muslims. Now everybody's kind of familiar with that kind of media trope. But last year, 2017, you had an interesting thing happening here, whereby Tesco ran a advertisement, and basically within a short, I think it was only about a minute and a half, and within that short advertisement, you have a Muslim families also celebrating Christmas. And then the entire Twitter sphere actually went berserk because a lot of people actually felt that it was actually offending Christians. So once again, you have a clear example of whereby, on the one hand, you're asking Muslims to integrate, and when they do step up to the mark, you basically say, well, something, you're actually reducing Christmas to a form of mockery. And when you do the kind of Twitter kind of a survey, if you like, I found this, and I thought it was really. I don't even know who this person is, but I thought that she had it kind of really, really knocked on the head, so to speak. The Christmas thing really gets me every year. Why don't they integrate? One Tesco advert later, why are they celebrating Christmas? It's just, once again, it just drives home the point about this idea of problematic nature of integration. Now, I started off by looking at the writings of W.E.B. Dubois, looking at the black experience. Now, if you really want to get intellectual about this, you can actually look at it also through the Jewish lens. And this person here, Zygmunt Bauman, sadly passed away last year. Great intellectual, wrote, 100-odd books, etc. He's an original thinker when it came to kind of sociology. This book here, Modernity and Ambivalence, if anybody wants to really get a head round the integration debate as far as the Jewish experience is concerned, this is a very, very interesting book. Page 120 to 121, he's basically saying, he's talking about this idea of assimilation as far as the Jewish question is concerned. And for those people who know, the history of Judaism, especially Reform Judaism, within the context of Germany, you will basically find that there was a huge intellectual drive and a shift that moved towards orthodoxy, more towards kind of liberal Judaism and Reform Judaism. And Zygmunt Bauman is basically offering a really insight here, and he's basically saying the assimilating Jews acted under the pressure to prove their Germanhood, yet the very attempt to prove it was held against them as evidence of their duplicity, and in all probability also a subversive intention. So in other words, that when you do integrate or assimilate, the host community basically used that against, to say that, well, if you could actually assimilate, it means that your intentions wasn't necessarily right to actually start off with. So in other words, to use a street terminology, you sold out, and if you can sell out in this respect, you can actually sell out in various other aspects as well. So I think there's something there about the problematic nature of defining integration, and what actually happens to kind of minority or minoritized communities in that respect. I think the second point is quite, I'll rush through this. The thing that you basically find is that you have segregated communities and neighbourhoods throughout the UK. Take 2011 census or 2001 census, you will find that there is areas which are high concentration of Pakistani, Indian, Bengali, Muslim communities. There are certain kind of spaces where you have high concentration of those kind of spatial concentration. But once again, if you take the long view from the 80s to 2001 to 2011, the thing that you basically find is that far from communities actually segregating, you basically find that the trend is actually going against segregation. So in other words, that you basically have a spatial kind of movement. And that fits in with a particular model within sociology called the Chicago School Model. And the Chicago School Model, to really quickly to summarize, is that when migrant communities, and this is a trial and tested model in the US with the Italians, communities, etc., where you basically have migrant coming over, concentration of poor neighborhoods, once they've basically got themselves economically in a sustained way, they kind of move out. Yep. So this idea of spatial mobility, if you like, is linked to the social economic context. And here, basically, I think it's a really important point, because often the case, what you basically find in certain neighborhoods is that you have class-based spatial segregation. And the fact that Muslim communities are often actually looked at it from the prism of culture, you kind of miss the class dimensions to it, if you like. Because if you look at the social economic profile, the Muslim community are also have a certain class dynamic, the white, the working class. But yet still, when we're talking about Muslim communities, we don't talk about them through the lenses of class. We talk about the white working class. And often the case, the decline of the white working class is predicated on the arrival of migrant communities in general, but Muslim communities in particular. This is a book by Ludi Simpson. Ludi Simpson was a professor of race and statistics at University of Manchester. And he's done all the number crunching in relation to kind of geographical, spatial segregation debate. He's actually taken that head on, and he basically finds that the evidence base for it to be very, very weak to start off with. And then the final point that I would basically point out is this, is that often the case, often the case that you find is that certain neighborhoods are by their nature segregated. They are segregated. And the assumption is that because they are segregated, that the argument extends to say that they are self-segregated. So in other words, that Muslims actually like to actually create themselves small ghettos. So there's a kind of a flawed kind of logic, if you like, that one from the other. And my argument has always been in this book is that segregated communities, as far as Muslim communities are concerned, in the past, say for example, under 2014-15, has actually kind of increased, and it's not increased because of the self-segregated nature. It's segregated because of the social, economic situation and positionalities actually people actually find themselves. So once again, you have Muslim communities in poor, deprived neighborhoods, and because of this close association between neighborhood and schools, a lot of people actually make the leap to say that, oh, these people are actually segregating themselves in the form of ghettos. But what you basically find when you interview parents, something like this, where one Muslim parent basically said, why would Muslim parents essentially want to send their children to failing schools in deprived neighborhoods? This self-segregated argument never made any sense. The real question isn't self-segregation, but rather poverty. So once again, just reinforcing the point of the class dynamics, the centrality of class dynamics in that respect. This is a really good book by Michael S. Merry. He's basically developing this idea of a defense of separation. And I don't have time because I've only got 5 minutes to actually go into it in great detail, but he basically uses his data not only from the UK but also Netherlands and Germany and various other European countries to make this point, that segregation is not a situation disadvantaged minorities have created themselves, nor have they invented the stigmas to which they are forced to actually live. And so in other words, that deprived communities are very much stigmatized communities. And within the Muslim space, you have what's known as the double stigma. They are stigmatized because they are living in poverty, but also they are stigmatized because that poverty is often conflated with their religion as well. So those are the kind of two kind of things to actually perhaps think about. And what I'd basically just offer, once again, that long-term situation is that the fact that we're in London is that if you walk to Brick Lane Mosque, you basically find that the Brick Lane Mosque, once upon a time, it used to be a Jewish synagogue. Because it was poor, deprived neighborhoods, that's where Jewish communities came to migrate. But before that, it was the French Protestant Huguenots that were escaping a persecution in France. So that exactly the same location used to be a place of worship for Christians. So basically what you've got, this spatial concentration and the spatial kind of shift of people can actually work within the Chicago school model. And recently I went to Brick Lane, and it's changed. I mean, it's become quite of a trendy Uber place where a lot of these what's the word that I'm looking for now? These trendy hipsters, yeah, it's become kind of gentrified. So I mean, I'm just hoping that these are perhaps insights that allows us to basically make sense of some of the changes, some of the dynamics, if you like.